Hi, it's Kim, and today we are talking about protists. Protists are a very interesting group of organisms because they have been classified as protists by default. In other words, these are the organisms who didn't really fit into any of the other groups of eukaryotes. So remember that eukaryotes include plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So protists are all of the organisms who are not plants, they aren't animals, and they aren't fungi, although they have many characteristics that seem like plants, animals, or fungi. So we usually call them animal-like, plant-like, and fungus-like, even though they don't really meet the characteristics of those organisms and so cannot be classified as such. So a protist is a eukaryotic organism that is not an animal, plant, or fungus. They do have all of the eukaryotic features, but they just don't have the characteristics that unite the animals or unite the plants or unite the fungi. If you look at the classification of all eukaryotes, this, by the way, is constantly changing in terms of how the protists are classified. They used to all be in one kingdom called Kingdom Protista, and that has not existed for some time. But if you look at this classification, these are all protists. These are all protists, all protists, all protists except for land plants, all protists. And then here, two of these are protists, the only ones who aren't the fungi and the animals. So you can see that most eukaryotes are protists, so there must be quite a lot of them. They are very significant organisms to understand for many, many reasons. Let's start though with some of the characteristics. So again, they're classified as protists because they don't fit into the other groups. Most of them are unicellular. So they are just a single-celled organism, but they have a lot of complexity for being unicellular. So remember, unicellular means the whole organism is just one cell. The reason they have complexity is because they are eukaryotes. So they have membranous organelles, they have DNA enclosed in a nucleus. They do a lot of complex things for being single-celled. No cell wall around these organisms. So because they don't have a cell wall made of cellulose, they aren't plants. They don't have a cell wall made of chitin, so they aren't fungi. Animals do not have a cell wall, but animals by definition have a lot of features, including the fact that they are multi-celled. So these are not animals, they are not plants, and they are not fungi. They can be autotrophs, which means they're photosynthetic for the most part, meaning they can make their own food through photosynthesis. Heterotrophs, meaning they have to eat. Or some, such as Euglena, which we'll look at in a minute, can do both. Euglena can eat and it can photosynthesize. They can be free-living or parasitic. Some of the parasitic protists are pathogens of humans, so they are very significant to us. It's important to know about them. They can actually reproduce sexually. So two protists can come in contact with each other and exchange gametes. Or they can reproduce asexually through binary fission. And I'm going to show you a video of that happening in a moment. They used to be classified based on their three major types of locomotion, especially the animal-like protists, which are called the protozoans. And we'll look at those three modes of locomotion today. They can move by what are called pseudopodia. This means false feet. By cilia, which are these hair-like structures that can propel the animal and help it filter feed, or flagella, which is a tail-like structure, such as what is on a sperm. They thrive in moist environments, including water, moist soil, and animal body fluids. So the parasitic ones obviously are thriving in animal body fluids, but we also have symbiotic protists in ourselves and in other animals that thrive in animal body fluids. So let's start by looking at the protozoan protists, and we're going to start with the amoebas. Okay, so the amoebas are shapeless, aquatic, and move with pseudopodia, and they are all predators. Let's look at a video of an amoeba moving through use of the pseudopodia and eating. So this is going to be an amoeba eating to paramecia, and I'm sorry, it's actually at the end of the video. Let's go backwards here. Try this. So cytoplasmic streaming, these are the false feet, the pseudopodia, devouring two paramecia, which is a ciliated protist that we'll look at in a minute. And now secreting enzymes to start digesting those paramecia. Pretty crazy. Okay, so that's an amoeba. They actually have what's called a contractile vacuole, and many protists have this, where they can control the amount of water moving in or out of the organism, and this is how they can get rid of waste materials also. You can see in this picture, the nucleus of this organism has made a copy of itself, and now this organism can divide through binary fission. I want to just quickly show you a video of a protist dividing by binary fission. This is actually a ciliated protist, but I just wanted to show you what binary fission is. So you've seen binary fission in bacteria. We don't need the music. It's not really making that sound as it divides. And you're going to see it basically is going to divide in half. So at this point, the nucleus has made a copy. And so the DNA is now in the two halves of the organism. And we can move forward here a little bit. And you can really see it's going to divide into two organisms. You get the idea. We don't need to watch the whole thing. So binary fission, you can see a picture here of an amoeba dividing into two. Pretty crazy. Amoeba can be pathogens in humans. I'm just going to give you two examples, but there are many examples of this. Amoebic dysentery affects a large percentage of the world's population. It causes extreme diarrhea and can actually cause death. It does result in death in immunocompromised people, and a lot of children worldwide die from amoebic dysentery. And it is passed through contaminated drinking water. Here's a pathogenic amoeba that you have heard about called Naegleria. It's the brain-eating amoeba. It can be found in hot springs and sometimes even in tap water. And people who use neti pots and don't use filtered water or bottled water, there have been several cases of people getting this brain-eating amoeba and dying very quickly. You usually die within 24 hours, and it's very rare. So last year in the United States, there were only 143 cases, but still that's enough to warrant concern. So I don't think you'd want to get this. It is treatable, but nobody really knows that they just got it. So by the time you would figure it out, you would probably already be dead or on your way to dying. Okay, so those are the amoeba. Again, they move with pseudopodia. They are protozoans because they are the animal-like protists. They eat. So these would be heterotrophs. There are ciliated protists, and you can see the cilia moving on this guy. This is a paramecium. This is the first protist most of us ever see in lab. I think in elementary school, we looked at these guys, and I remember our teacher saying they look like a slipper, and it kind of does look like a slipper. These are mostly found in fresh water. And even though they're single-celled, they are very complex. I'm always blown away by this figure of everything going on in this guy. He even has an anal pore, food vacuoles, a macronucleus and a micronucleus, these contractile vacuoles that regulate water, an oral groove. So as these cilia are moving, they're pushing food into this oral groove where they're going to come into this cellular mouth and get digested. So let me show you, I believe I have some ciliated protists here. Let's rewind this. Sorry, I started watching all these and I didn't rewind. Look, you can see the contractile vacuole here filling with water. And you can see all this little stuff in the water can be filtered out and eaten. I'll turn the music down. So that's a ciliated protist. Again, they can divide through binary fission, but they can also have sexual reproduction. So here you see two paramecia doing what's called conjugation. They're actually exchanging genetic information. And that's really important because remember, diversity in the population is very important to make a population resistant to environmental change. In other words, adaptation counts on there being diversity in the gene pool. And you can't get that if everyone just reproduces asexually. The next group of protists that are protozoans, because they're more animal-like than plant-like, are the flagellates. So these are the protists that move with the flagellum, and I'm going to show you that movement in a minute, but right away, I'm showing you one that causes a disease in humans. Trypanosoma causes sleeping sickness, and it actually is spread by an intermediate host. The vector is the tsetse fly. Remember, a vector is an organism that transmits the pathogen. So the trypanosome flagellate doesn't get directly into humans. It's in the fly, which is what's called the vector. Here you can see they kind of look like worms, but they're not. These are flagellated protists. Giardia, which can be found in contaminated spring water. So if you're backpacking, camping, and you drink water from a stream and you start having intestinal cramping and diarrhea, you most likely got giardiasis. These flagellated protists live in stream water and can make you very, very sick. Let's look at a flagellate. This is actually Euglena. Euglena is plant-like and animal-like, but it's a good example of a flagellate moving. I love the music they choose for these videos. It's so funny. So you can see the flagellum moving here. It's kind of hard to see. I mean, remember, these guys are really small. You can see chloroplasts in this Euglena. These guys can eat or they can photosynthesize. So that's pretty amazing. Here they are at lower power on the microscope. And so you can kind of see the pattern of their movement a little better. And they're moving with a flagellum. It's hard to see in this picture. Okay, then there are some animal-like protists who actually don't move because they are 100% parasitic. And a good example of that is the parasite that causes malaria. So they're called sporozoans. They're protozoa who actually have no locomotion. If you are a parasite in an organism, you don't necessarily need to move, especially if you're in the bloodstream. And that's what the ultimate site of infection of the malaria parasite is, our red blood cells. But it actually starts in a mosquito. So a mosquito is going to pick up this specific stage of the parasite, and it's going to mature and migrate to the salivary glands of the mosquito. And then once it's in the salivary glands of the mosquito, it can now get transmitted to another person. So they show this mosquito biting the same person, but this would be spread to another person, goes to the liver, where it starts going through another stage of the life cycle, and ultimately it's going to parasitize the red blood cells. This is under the microscope. the red blood cells of an infected person. They say that this stage of the life cycle of Plasmodium looks like a diamond ring. So it's circular, and then you can see this one region right here that they say looks like a diamond ring. So Plasmodium is the protist that causes malaria. Malaria is a major concern worldwide, especially in areas of Africa. Not last year, sorry, this is stats for 2018 from the World Health Organization, 228 million cases of malaria and approximately 1 million deaths. The death rate has gone down due to a lot of different measures that we're taking to try to keep people from dying from malaria and making sure people in these areas get the drugs they need to treat malaria. It's only deadly if it's not treated. It is treatable. They still have not found an effective vaccine for malaria, even though they've been working on it for many, many years. Okay, so those are just examples of the animal-like protists. Again, locomotion is kind of how a lot of them are classified. This is Euglena that we just saw in the video, plant-like and animal-like. Again, it has chloroplasts, but it can also eat. So that's pretty crazy. And again, very complex for a single-celled organism. Then we have the plant-like protists, and they're often called algae. So they're photosynthetic. They can actually be multicellular and unicellular, and they're classified by the type of pigment they have. So we have red algae, brown algae, the green algae, and we're going to look at those. They are the base of the food chain in the ocean, so they are incredibly important. They actually produce about 50% of the oxygen on Earth through photosynthesis and releasing that oxygen. So not only are they the base of the food chain in the oceans, they really contribute to our oxygen supply on Earth. They also take in a huge percentage of carbon dioxide. Incredibly, incredibly important, these algae-like protists. Diatoms are these amazingly beautiful protists that have silica glass shells. If you have diatomaceous earth in your swimming pool filter, then you've seen diatoms before. They can be used as insulating material. They're really abrasive, so they can be used in different cleaners. They're used in ceramics. Again, they're used in swimming pool filters. Once they decompose, they can become fossil fuels. Very beautiful when you look at these under the microscope, all these different shapes. And these are actually living organisms. Pretty crazy, these shells that they can get. They're beautiful. Dinoflagellates, again, another important part of the food chain. And we see these periodically in San Diego when we get a red tide. And as you know, that red tide can actually be bioluminescent. And you've probably seen that at some point if you've been to the beach during a red tide. You go at night and you can see the waves glowing from these bioluminescent dinoflagellates, which are protists. Looking at the green algae, again, these are a major source of food. They're referred to as plankton, in fact, phytoplankton. There's zooplankton and phytoplankton. These are the plant-like plankton. They, again, produce oxygen and take in CO2. Some are free-living, some are colonial, some are filamentous, so they form these filaments. This is Volvox. Volvox is actually one of my favorite protists because they're colonial, which is pretty amazing. And if you think about it, we've gone in this organism from single-celled organisms acting independently to now have cells aggregating, working cooperatively, and they're actually almost bound together as one unit, performing similar functions. That is what tissues do in animals and in plants. So going from single-celled independent organisms to a colonial, almost acting as a superorganism, all of these single-celled organisms working together, that is the precursor for multi-celled organisms. That is really significant. I want to show you this video of Volvox. So here they are swimming. Those are a bunch of single-celled protists forming this colony. Again, we have some good protist music going on here. I'm going to turn that down. So these particular cells have 2 flagella each. They have contractile vacuoles. Chloroplasts. There's something significant coming up I want you to see. That's their classification. So they can have 1 flagellum or 2. That's not the significant part though. I'm waiting for it. Here we go. They're attached to each other by cytoplasmic strands. So these cells can actually almost communicate with each other and work in a coordinated fashion. That's what tissues are. Tissues are a group of cells working together to perform similar functions. So when we start looking at plants and animals, that's really significant to think about how a single-celled organism can evolve this coordinated lifestyle that could then become a multicellular organism. Okay, here's some free-floating algae. Again, major part of the food chain. Filamentous algae. Here are the colonial algae. Red and brown algae, including kelp. Kelp is not a plant. Kelp is an algae, which is a protist. Red algae. So we eat this, right? If you eat sushi, this is what you're eating. The kelp are beautiful. The kelp forests in California, major ecosystem for marine life. You go to Point Loma, you can look out and really see the kelp forests really well. You'll see where the kelp are because that's where the fishing boats are sitting if it's the daytime. Okay, and then finally we have some fungus-like protists, and the slime molds are pretty amazing. So this is a protist. This is not a fungus. And there are actually over 900 species of slime molds. Pretty crazy. There are some beneficial protists, so they don't just cause disease. They can form symbiotic relationships with different organisms. Some classic examples are coral. The coral polyps have a symbiotic relationship with photosynthetic protists. The protist produces food for the coral, and the coral is giving shelter and a place, a home to the protist. Guts of termites. The way termites are able to digest all that cellulose in the wood are the protists that live in their guts. We talked about bacteria that live in the guts of cows, sheep, goats, all of the hoofed mammals who have a high cellulose diet. Remember, animals do not have enzymes to break down cellulose into glucose. They rely on microorganisms to do that. We talked about bacteria who have those enzymes. There are also protists living in the guts of those animals that help them break down the cellulose into glucose. That's an incredibly important role of protists. They feed a large portion of the world's aquatic species. They're, the base of the food chain, and they produce about 50% of the planet's oxygen. They also, of course, take in CO2. Blue, green, and brown algae are being grown for biofuel. Wouldn't that be great if that could replace traditional fossil fuel? It's about 50% oil. It can be harvested and processed very quickly, grows very fast, so you can keep up with the demand. It's a renewable resource. Okay, unlike fossil fuels are not renewable. Fossil fuels, by the way, originated from the remains of prehistoric animals and brown algae. Okay, so that's it for protists.